What if you judged someone based on their appearance, only to realize you were completely wrong? The airport was alive with the usual chaos. People rushed past each other, their footsteps echoing against the hard tile floors, while overhead announcements crackled through the speakers. The rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases added to the symphony of sounds. Among this bustling scene, Gate 24 was packed with travelers waiting for their flight to Dallas. But one woman stood out among the crowd. In her late 40s, she was impeccably dressed in a navy blazer and high heels that clicked sharply with every step. Her posture was perfect, her demeanor one of quiet superiority as she moved through the crowd. She seemed to be scanning the first-class line, almost as if assessing who truly belonged there, and who didn't. That's when she saw him. A young man, no older than 16, standing confidently in line. His outfit was casual, jeans, a hoodie, and a bright red cap that caught her eye immediately. It wasn't just any hat, though. It was a MAGA hat. The bold letters embroidered on the cap seemed to ignite something within her. She narrowed her eyes and muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable." The young man was absorbed in his phone, occasionally glancing at the gate agent, who was preparing for boarding. He didn't seem to notice the woman's glaring gaze or her growing sense of indignation. But for her, the sight of him, dressed so casually, and wearing that hat, was more than she could tolerate. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone like him had no business being in the first-class line. Did he even have enough money to afford a first-class ticket? Did he think that hat gave him some kind of free pass to places he didn't belong? Her thoughts ran wild, each one more judgmental than the last. Then, the boarding announcement rang through the air. The young man began to move forward, ticket in hand. As he approached the gate, the woman stepped closer, her heels clicking loudly on the floor, making her presence known. This was a moment she wasn't going to let slide. Before the line began to move, she positioned herself directly in front of him, blocking his path. Her perfectly composed demeanor now had an edge to it, tinged with irritation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I think you might be in the wrong line." The young man blinked, clearly confused, and looked around before turning back to her. "No, this is first class," he said calmly, holding up his boarding pass. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at the red hat on his head. "First class," she repeated with a skeptical laugh. "You're telling me you bought a first-class ticket?" Her voice carried enough to catch the attention of others nearby. A few people turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. But the young man remained composed. "Yes, ma'am," he replied politely. "Is there a problem?" The woman's arms crossed as she looked him up and down, her voice sharpening. "I don't know who you think you are," she said, "but first class is for people who, well, let's just say it's for people who belong here." She gestured toward his hat. "I'm not sure someone with that attitude belongs in this line." The young man's expression didn't change. He tilted his head slightly and paused before speaking, his voice steady and measured. "Ma'am, I'm just here to board my flight like everyone else. My ticket's valid, and I don't think it's anyone's business where I sit." Her judgment only deepened, and she scoffed loudly. She turned to the others in line, looking for validation. "Can you believe this?" she asked, her voice rising. "First class used to mean something, now anyone can just." Her words were interrupted by the gate agent, who had stepped out from behind her desk, a no-nonsense look on her face. "Is there a problem here?" the gate agent asked, her voice calm but firm. The woman, startled by the interruption, shifted her tone to one of feigned innocence. "I'm just saying," she began, "I think it's a little suspicious that someone like him," she paused to glance at the young man again, "is in this line. I mean, look at him." The crowd began to murmur. Some passengers exchanged glances, while others whispered to one another. A man in a business suit muttered, "What's her problem?" while a younger woman with a toddler shot the woman a disapproving glare. The gate agent raised her hand to quiet the crowd. "Let me see your boarding pass, sir," she said, turning to the young man. With a calm nod, he handed over his pass. The gate agent scanned it, glanced at her screen, and nodded. Mr. Barron Trump. First class. Everything checks out. A wave of silence washed over the onlookers. All eyes snapped back to the young man, who stood there unfazed, his calm demeanor untouched by the earlier scrutiny. The woman blinked in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "Wait, she stammered. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. That's my name." At that moment, everything shifted. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and several people began to pull out their phones, snapping pictures or quickly Googling his name. The woman's world seemed to tilt, her earlier confidence now shattered. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't over yet. Barron Trump's next words would change everything. The moment the woman blocked his path, the entire atmosphere shifted. The rhythmic sound of rolling suitcases and murmuring voices faded into the background, as if the world had momentarily held its breath. The sharp click of her heels against the floor echoed through the terminal, growing louder as she stood in front of him, a wall of condescension in human form. Her eyes burned with disdain, her voice dripping with superiority. "Excuse me," she said, her tone cutting through the air like a blade, "I think you might be in the wrong line." Her words weren't a simple question, they were a command, a statement that presumed his very presence there was an error. She stood tall, her chest out, an imperious posture that spoke volumes of the judgment she was passing upon him. The young man looked at her, momentarily startled by her forceful approach. His brows furrowed in confusion, his phone still loosely held in his hand. He glanced at the gate agent, who was now looking up in mild curiosity, but his gaze quickly returned to the woman standing before him. The crowd around them had stilled, sensing the tension in the air. Conversations had halted, and even the hum of the airport felt distant, drowned out by the palpable tension between them. "No, this is first class," he replied, his voice calm and steady, yet firm. He didn't step back or shrink away from her harsh gaze. Instead, he held up his boarding pass, offering it with a sense of quiet confidence. His eyes met hers without flinching, unbothered by her judgmental gaze. The woman's lips twisted into a disbelieving smile, but it wasn't one of humor, it was a sneer. "First class," she repeated, her voice rising in disbelief, her words sharp like the edge of a knife. "You're telling me you bought a first-class ticket?" Her laughter, though mocking, was loud enough for several people in the line to turn their heads. Her condescending tone cut through the air, each syllable dripping with disbelief. "This is first class, not, well, I'm sure you know what I mean." She gestured at his outfit, eyes flicking over him from head to toe with a dismissive sneer. The bright red hat perched on his head seemed to enrage her further, as if it alone were enough to disqualify him from being in such an exclusive space. The young man didn't flinch. His calmness only seemed to fuel her indignation. The crowd had begun to murmur, eyes darting back and forth between them, sensing the mounting tension. Whispers of disbelief spread through the group, some were shocked, others confused. One man in a suit gave a low mutter, his voice barely audible, "What's her problem?" A mother holding her child cast the woman a disapproving look, clearly uncomfortable with the woman's harshness. But the woman pressed on, her voice rising. "I don't know who you think you are, but first class is for people who," she trailed off, her eyes scanning his casual attire once more, as if trying to justify her sense of superiority. "Let's just say it's for people who belong here," she finished, her words sharp, as though she were speaking not just to him, but to everyone around them. The young man's lips tightened slightly, but his gaze remained steady. There was no anger in his eyes, no defensiveness. Just a quiet, resolute strength that seemed to rise above her hostility. His words were simple, but they cut through the tension like a still, calm voice in the midst of a storm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice measured and composed, "I'm just here to board my flight like everyone else. My ticket's valid, and I don't think it's anyone's business where I sit." For a moment, the woman stood there, stunned by the calmness of his response. It was as if he had extinguished the fire of her judgment with a single sentence. Her chest heaved with indignation, but she couldn't find the words to tear him down. His calmness was infuriating, as if his very presence challenged her belief in her own superiority. She scoffed loudly, throwing a glance at the others in line as though seeking validation for her attack. "Can you believe this?" she asked, raising her voice for all to hear. "First class used to mean something, now it's just, anyone can." Her words trailed off into nothingness, her attempt to rally the crowd falling flat. The gate agent, now fully aware of the escalating situation, looked up from her desk with a raised eyebrow. She took a step forward, her gaze shifting between the woman and the young man. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The woman turned to face the agent, her tone quickly shifting to one of faux innocence. "I'm just saying," she began, the edge of her earlier hostility still lacing her words, "it's a little suspicious that someone like him," she motioned again at the young man, her eyes narrowing, "is in this line. Look at him." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, whispers of judgment mixed with disbelief. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. A few onlookers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke out. The gate agent, her expression hardening, crossed her arms and took a step forward. "Let me see your boarding pass, sir," she said to the young man. Without hesitation, he handed over his ticket. The gate agent took it, scanning it carefully. For a moment, the whole terminal seemed to hold its breath. Then, she looked at her screen, glanced back at the young man, and nodded with a firm professionalism. "Mr. Barron Trump," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "First class. Everything checks out." The words hung in the air like a sudden jolt of electricity. The crowd froze. It was as though the entire airport had collectively inhaled. Barron Trump. The name landed like a bombshell, shattering the tension. All eyes snapped back to the young man, who stood there with the same composed expression, unfazed by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The woman's mouth opened and closed as if she were trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. Her shock was written all over her face, and for the first time, the confidence she had exuded earlier began to crack. Her voice faltered as she stammered, "Wait, you're..." Barron's simple nod confirmed the truth. "Yes, ma'am. That's my name." And in that moment, the woman realized just how far off the mark her judgment had been. The crowd, once silent, began to murmur in astonishment, some pulling out their phones, others glancing at each other in disbelief. The weight of the situation sank in, and the woman was left standing there, speechless, as the young man moved forward, his dignity intact, his composure unwavering. What happened next would change everything. In the face of the woman's harsh judgment and the growing tension in the crowd, Barron Trump remained remarkably composed. His posture didn't shift, his gaze didn't waver. He wasn't rattled, nor was he eager to engage in a back and forth with someone who had just tried to humiliate him. Instead, he looked at her calmly, his expression still polite but firm. It was as if the chaos around him hadn't registered at all. His words, when they finally came, were delivered with a quiet dignity that drew the eyes of everyone in the terminal. "Ma'am, I'm just here to board my flight like anyone else," Barron began, his voice steady and respectful, yet carrying a weight that made it impossible for anyone to ignore. He spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure each word was clear and carried its intended meaning. "My ticket is valid, and I don't think it's anyone's business where I sit." The woman, whose confidence had been so bold only moments ago, seemed momentarily stunned by his calmness. Her mouth opened as if to respond, but Barron continued before she could find her words. "You know," he said, a hint of softness entering his tone, "my dad always taught me to treat people with respect, even when they don't show it back. How you act says more about you than it does about anyone else." His words hung in the air like a quiet storm. The crowd, previously tense with anticipation, now seemed to draw closer, their focus entirely on Barron. There was something about the sincerity in his voice that cut through the noise. His gaze didn't falter. He wasn't seeking validation, nor was he eager to escalate the situation. He was merely stating the truth, calmly, resolutely, and with a poise that left no room for rebuttal. For a brief moment, the woman's bravado melted away, her eyes narrowing as she tried to hold on to some shred of control. But it was clear she was struggling. The silence that followed Barron's words was thick, heavy, and for the first time, it was she who felt small in the midst of the crowd. Barron's calm demeanor didn't just quiet the immediate confrontation, it shifted the energy in the room entirely. The murmurs around the terminal had changed. What was once a mixture of curiosity and judgment now morphed into quiet reflection. People shifted uncomfortably in their spots, some glancing away as if they too had realized how quickly they had judged him. Others exchanged looks, clearly moved by the unspoken wisdom of his response. Barron didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried more weight than any angry retort could have. In that moment, he had managed to turn the situation from one of confrontation to one of introspection. It was a quiet demonstration of his character, a lesson in humility and self-control. "You judged me without knowing anything about me," Barron continued, his voice never rising above a soft murmur. "All you saw was a hat. But here's the thing, that hat doesn't define me. Just like your words today don't have to define you." His gaze never left the woman's face. It was as though he was silently daring her to reconsider, not just the judgment she had passed on him, but on herself as well. His words weren't just for her, they were for everyone within earshot. Barron's tone softened even more as he finished, and the change in the air was palpable. It was no longer a confrontation. It was a quiet exchange of wisdom. "I didn't choose to be in the position I'm in," he said, stepping just a little closer to the woman, "but I do get to choose how I act. And right now, I'm choosing not to argue with you. There's enough fighting in the world, don't you think?" The woman stood frozen, her face flushed crimson as she tried to process what had just happened. Her body language had shifted from one of dominance to one of defeat. The fire in her eyes had been replaced with uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak but no words came out. Around her, the crowd had gone silent. No one dared to interrupt. Even the gate agent, who had been standing off to the side, was motionless, her gaze fixed on Barron as if she too had just witnessed something extraordinary. There was a moment of shared understanding among the onlookers, a recognition that Barron had just done something that few could have done in his place. He had diffused an entire situation without raising his voice, without reacting to provocation, and with a quiet dignity that left everyone in the room humbled. The weight of Barron's words lingered in the air as he looked around the crowd once more, his gaze lingering on the woman who had attempted to humiliate him. There was no smugness in his expression, only a quiet, sincere wish for peace and understanding. "I hope your day gets better," Barron added softly, his voice carrying a finality to it that marked the end of the exchange. "And I hope you'll think twice before making someone else feel small." The last part of his sentence hung in the air, almost like a challenge, though gentle, it was clear in its intent. His words weren't just for her. They were a message for the entire crowd. They were a reminder that dignity and respect shouldn't be contingent on appearances, status, or preconceived notions. Barron Trump, in that simple, calm moment, had shown more strength than anyone had expected. As he turned to continue his journey down the jet bridge, the crowd remained still for just a moment longer, their silence filled with a mixture of admiration, guilt, and a sense of reflection. Some started to nod, as if agreeing with the gravity of what Barron had just said. Others clapped softly, almost as if they too were acknowledging a rare act of grace in a world so often defined by conflict and division. The woman, meanwhile, was left standing there, her earlier indignation now replaced with a quiet realization that this moment had not gone the way she had planned. The air at Gate 24 felt different now. The murmurs, which had once been full of curiosity and judgment, had quieted to a soft buzz of reflection. The woman, who had so confidently confronted Barron Trump just moments ago, now stood there, her shoulders slumped, her eyes searching the crowd for any sign of support. But it was clear, the support she sought didn't come. Instead, she was met with the cold stares of those who had witnessed her confrontation. The faces that surrounded her, once filled with intrigue, now wore expressions of disappointment, and a few even showed open disapproval. A low, uncomfortable silence enveloped her, the weight of her actions settling heavily on her chest. She had been so sure of herself, her judgment, her sense of superiority. But now, as she looked around, she saw only the reality of what had just happened. She had become the spectacle, the one who had judged too hastily, too loudly. The crowd had turned, and they weren't looking at her with admiration. They were looking at her with the same scrutiny she had once directed at Barron. For a few long seconds, she stood frozen, her face flushed with a deep crimson. The anger, the arrogance, those things seemed distant now, as if they belonged to someone else. The sharpness in her voice, the condescending sneer, had all vanished. In their place was a strange, uncomfortable regret. She could feel the weight of Barron's words still hanging in the air, echoing in her mind. How you act says more about you than it does about anyone else. As she stood there, the gate agent moved to the counter, her attention back to her work, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, too. She had witnessed everything. The woman could feel the judgment in the air, the eyes on her. The people around her were moving on, but not without making their own quiet assessments. The young mother holding the toddler had been one of the first to speak up, urging the woman to apologize. The words had stuck with her. "You really owe him an apology," the woman had said. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of a truth she couldn't ignore. And so, as the last of the boarding passengers moved past, she slowly turned toward the gate agent, her head hanging low. There was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes before she started toward the jet bridge, but something had shifted inside her. Her confidence had evaporated, leaving only the raw truth of what she had done. The earlier feelings of superiority had given way to something far less certain, regret. As she settled into her seat on the plane, the long, drawn-out moments of reflection began to sink in. Her mind replayed Barron's words again and again, each time more clearly. He hadn't just responded to her actions, he had quietly transformed the entire situation. He had turned her judgment back on herself, forcing her to reckon with the choices she had made. She hadn't expected this kind of response. She hadn't expected grace, dignity, and strength. She had assumed Barron would be rattled, that he would retreat or fight back. But instead, he had simply stood firm, unshaken, and in doing so, he had made her the one who felt small. She closed her eyes, her hands trembling slightly. The shame was hard to shake. She had been so quick to judge, so eager to make assumptions about someone based on the way they looked, based on the hat on his head. And in doing so, she had revealed the worst part of herself, her willingness to dismiss someone because they didn't fit her idea of what belonged in a place like first class. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the woman felt a rising sense of urgency. She couldn't let this go. She had to make things right, even if it meant swallowing her pride. Barron had already boarded and taken his seat, but there was still time. She couldn't shake the image of him, calm, dignified, unaffected by her attempts to diminish him. With a deep breath, she stood up, her steps hesitant but determined. As she walked toward the section where Barron was seated, her heart pounded in her chest. What would he say? Would he even listen? Would he dismiss her apology or simply shrug it off? She reached his row, her voice soft but sincere. "Barron," she began, her words careful, almost tentative. He looked up, his face neutral but not unkind. There was no trace of the anger or resentment that she had half expected. Instead, he looked at her as though he were simply waiting for her to speak. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "For what I said back at the gate. You didn't deserve that. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I was wrong. For a long moment, Barron simply looked at her. His expression remained calm, his eyes steady, but there was a flicker of something softer in them, something that suggested he had already moved past the incident. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to show any sign of anger or frustration. His silence was enough. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate you saying that." And then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he added, "We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them." The woman stood there for a moment longer, the weight of Barron's response sinking in. There was no accusation in his words, no bitterness. Just an acceptance that felt, in a way, like a release. As she returned to her seat, the guilt she had carried with her for so long started to fade. Barron had shown her something profound. The power of humility, the grace of moving beyond pride, and the strength it takes to simply forgive. The plane took off, the hum of the engines filling the cabin, but for the woman, the world felt different. Lighter. She had been given a second chance, not only by Barron but by herself. And as she looked out the window, watching the world below grow smaller, she knew she would never forget this moment, the lesson of a young man who had shown her the true meaning of respect. As the plane soared higher, the cabin settled into a quiet hum, but the tension from the earlier encounter lingered in the air. Passengers, their eyes distant and their minds clearly still processing the scene they had just witnessed, began to murmur softly amongst themselves. The conversation that had once been about trivial matters, vacations, work, the weather, had shifted. Now, the topic on everyone's lips was something far more profound. A man sitting a few rows behind the woman who had confronted Barron turned to his neighbor, shaking his head slightly. "Did you see that? The way he handled that situation. He didn't even flinch. Most people would have gotten defensive or angry. But he stayed calm, stayed respectful." His seatmate nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Yeah, it's not easy to do that. Especially when someone's treating you like that in front of everyone. It takes a lot of strength to stay composed." Most people would have snapped back, but he didn't. He was a lot stronger than she was. Across the aisle, a young couple whispered to each other, their voices low but filled with admiration. That was impressive. She was trying to put him down, but he just turned it around. He didn't let her get to him. That's something we can all learn from. The older man sitting by the window, who had been quietly watching the exchange, leaned over to his wife. You know, the way he said it, it was almost like he was giving her a lesson, not just standing up for himself. He didn't need to get angry to make his point. It's like he taught everyone in that room something about how to handle conflict with dignity. The woman nodded slowly, her face reflecting the realization that the situation had changed something within her too. "Yeah, you're right. It's like he was saying, you don't need to let someone else's disrespect affect who you are. Your actions speak louder than anything they can say." As the flight continued, these small conversations blossomed throughout the cabin. The ripple effect of Barron's calm demeanor and strong values spread, touching everyone who had witnessed the scene. The message was simple but profound: respect, patience, and restraint were far more powerful than anger or judgment. It was a quiet revolution in the hearts of the passengers, one that none of them had expected when they boarded the plane. When the plane landed, the passengers disembarked one by one, but the energy in the air was different. There was no immediate rush, no clamor of voices shouting over one another. People moved with a kind of slow, reflective purpose, as if the events that had unfolded on the flight had made them see the world a little differently. A man with a briefcase paused by the gate, pulling out his phone. He wasn't checking emails or messages. Instead, he was searching something, Barron Trump. Nearby, the young woman with the toddler, who had been one of the first to speak out in defense of Barron, gave a knowing glance to her child as they walked down the jet bridge. "Remember what we talked about," she said softly. Her child nodded, too young to fully understand the complexity of what had happened, but already grasping the concept of kindness and respect. And in the back of the cabin, the woman who had confronted Barron earlier, now feeling small and humbled, caught a glimpse of the stewardess, who smiled at her with a certain warmth. It was a look that said more than words ever could, "You're not the person you were when you boarded this flight." As the passengers made their way through the terminal, many of them found themselves thinking back to that moment, thinking about Barron's words, his poise, his quiet strength. Some of them had been inspired to reassess their own actions, to be more conscious of how they treated others. Others were left with a newfound respect for the power of calm in the face of confrontation. Barron hadn't just defended his place in first class, he had changed the atmosphere of the entire flight, leaving an imprint on the hearts of everyone who had witnessed his grace. And as the woman who had confronted him walked out of the airport, she felt it too. A weight had lifted, replaced by a humility she hadn't expected to find. In the end, it wasn't Barron who had learned a lesson, it was everyone else. As the plane landed and the hustle of the airport began to take over, Barron leaned back in his seat for a brief moment of quiet reflection. He thought about his father's words, which had been engraved in his heart since he was young, "Rise above the hostility, rise above the judgments, and let your actions speak for who you truly are." It wasn't just advice, it was a code he had lived by, even when facing adversity, even when others tried to impose their own preconceived notions onto him. He'd seen how quickly people judged, how easily they dismissed others based on appearances, but in that moment, he had proven something far greater than being right. He had demonstrated the power of composure and the strength of maintaining dignity under pressure. The woman had tried to provoke him, to break him, but he had chosen the high road. His actions had spoken volumes, and the ripple effect of that moment would echo far beyond this flight. Barron knew that the most important thing wasn't about winning arguments or proving a point, it was about showing kindness and grace, even in the face of judgment. That was the lesson he wanted everyone to take with them. It was a quiet but powerful reminder that the world can always use more humility, more respect, and more empathy. As the passengers of the flight began to leave the terminal, the story of what had unfolded at Gate 24 would linger in their minds, weaving into their own thoughts and actions in ways they couldn't quite predict. What had seemed like a simple interaction had turned into a profound lesson, a lesson about how we treat others, how we react to prejudice, and how we can change the atmosphere simply by choosing to remain calm and respectful in the face of hostility. Barron's quiet strength had shown them all that our actions, especially when faced with adversity, define us far more than any external factor could. His calmness, his unwavering dignity, his refusal to let the words of others dictate his worth, had left an impression that wouldn't fade easily. Now, as you reflect on this story, take a moment to think, how often do we allow judgment and prejudice to shape our reactions? How often do we let anger or frustration cloud our better judgment? Barron's story is a reminder that our true strength lies not in how we respond in anger, but in how we maintain our grace when it's hardest to do so. If this story resonated with you and made you think about how you handle difficult situations, share your thoughts with us in the comments below. How do you strive to stay calm and respectful when facing judgment or prejudice? We would love to hear your reflections. And if you enjoyed this story and want to see more impactful and inspiring content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us for more heartwarming stories. Let's continue to share kindness, patience, and wisdom in a world that needs it more than ever. Thank you for watching, and remember, it's our actions, not our circumstances, that truly define us.